Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, hidden phone apps, overcrowded jails, Israeli-Palestinian violence, war-torn Syria, and the latest updates on the Paris attacks that have shaken Europe. But first, refugees go home. EU leaders are seeking desperate measures to stop refugees from entering European countries. Holding a summit in Malta this past week, they met with their African counterparts to strike a deal that would basically remove a load of African asylum seekers off their hands. But some are calling this grand bargaining.
Interesting. As part of the deal, the African governments are to crack down on their borders and speed up measures to take back hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants deported from Europe. In exchange for acting as Europe's border guards, the governments are to receive funding from the EU countries estimated at about 3.6 billion euros. Now, there is also the promise of offering visas for well-qualified Africans.
Critics of the agreements are concerned for the lives of the migrants. Ivernor McGowan, director of the EU Department of Amnesty International, told the AFP news agency the EU is seeking to transfer its migration problem. This can lead to an outsourcing of human rights violations and is quite worrying.
Well, continuing our coverage on the increasing violence between Israelis and Palestinians, there have been more deaths in the past few days. 2 Palestinians have been killed and several others injured by Israeli forces in the occupied territories of East Jerusalem after allegedly trying to stab one Israeli police officer.
Another Palestinian was shot dead outside the Damascus gate, and Israeli troops gunned down a 22-year-old woman at a checkpoint in the West Bank. Now, both killings were the result of more suspected stabbing attacks. Protesters in a refugee camp have also been injured in clashes with Israeli forces. Now, since the violence erupted at the beginning of October, at least 84 Palestinians have been killed and more than 2,700 injured.
Yeah, that's an amazing number. Some say the stabbing incidents may be a setup. Paul Lawardy, co-founder of the Free Palestinian or Palestine movement, told RT half of these stabbing incidents are very suspect. It's uncertain whether there's any attempted stabbing that took place because it's very easy to place a knife at the scene where a Palestinian man or woman has been executed. And there are witnesses who say there was no knife.
No knife. As we see these latest deaths, a new poll shows 53% of the Israelis support the killing of Palestinian assailants on the spot. 53%. Shoot them on the spot.
No questions asked.
No questions asked. Now, the report also found that 80% of respondents believe the family home of the Palestinians engaged in anti-Israeli attacks must be demolished.
What about the families of those assailants?
I guess they're not concerned with the family. It's demolish the house.
Wow, amazing.
Well, some analysts say the Palestinian acts are justifiable considering the brutal occupation they are struggling with.
Definitely a tit-for-tat situation
Absolutely.
in that area. Well, meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has arrived in Washington to meet with U.S. President Barack Obama. Many believe despite rising violence in the occupied territories, Netanyahu plans to focus on military aid from the U.S.
Now, video has surfaced online showing an Israeli police officer assaulting Palestinian journalists while covering the clashes in the West Bank. Fatih Arori, the journalist who shot the video, works for the Xinhua news agency. He says the Israeli officer was deliberately chasing down journalists.
In an interview with RT, he explained the attack We were covering the event taking place in the northern city of Al-Beret, when suddenly the Israeli army arrested one man who had already been hit by an Israeli jeep. Journalists rushed to get footage of the incident, but an officer from the border guards unit began using pepper spray on the cameramen and the paramedics, beating and pushing some of them.
I felt my life was under threat, he continued. Some journalists were left unconscious, while others were transferred for treatment to the hospital. What was most bizarre, one of the officers tried to remove our gas masks, which we were wearing to protect us from being pepper sprayed directly in our faces. Well, when the Israeli police were contacted for a response, they had no comment, but this is not the first time they have been accused of attacking members of the press.
Well, Israel is not the only land with unrest. In Cashmere, near the city of Jamar Masjid, police fired tear gas to calm protesters who took to the streets after Friday prayers. Clashes erupted when groups of youths gathered on the main road outside the city and threw stones at security personnel. They are angry about the killing of an engineering student during a protest the previous week.
Well, turning now to war-torn Syria and Turkey's renewed calls for a safe zone for refugees there. The Syrian army has fought its way to an air base near Aleppo that's been under attack from ISIL militants for nearly 2 years. Now, hundreds of Syrian soldiers were reportedly freed in what is being called one of the biggest victories for Syria's army since the Russians began airstrikes against ISIL in order to aid the Syrian government.
But not everyone supports President Bashar al-Assad's government. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was expected to use his presidency at the G20 summit to try and persuade allies, which would include the United States, of course, against giving Syrian Kurdish rebels a greater role in the conflict.
According to Euronews, the Turkish president gave what he called a friendly warning, although he didn't specify to who, but said, if you do not take a principled stand against terrorism, at the end, this fire will fly back in your face. Those countries who think they're living in confidence and prosperity should not forget that you never know what can happen tomorrow.
Wow. Well, the United States recently celebrated another Veterans Day, but despite celebrations, some veterans still feel alone the rest of the year. Current statistics from the Department of Veterans Affairs and analysts show more U.S. veterans killed themselves than died in Iraq and Afghanistan.
At an alarming rate, 22 veterans a day now take their own lives. Suicide rates among veterans is 50% higher than civilians and outrank cancer, heart disease, homicide, and transportation accidents as the leading cause of death. Now, PTSD, or the post-traumatic stress disorder, is one of the leading causes. And, you know, Katan, one of the soldiers commented in this report that the nightmares and the flashbacks and the things that they see, most people will never see here in the United States. And they reported how they can't get the thoughts out of their mind. They're there and they never leave. And that's one of the things that adds to that stress, and you know, eventually they just can't take it.
Yeah, you can leave from the places of war, but you can't leave from the images in your mind. Yeah, that's got to be difficult. Well, Luis Ortiz from Napa, California got the scare of his life when what started out as a splitting headache quickly wound him up in the emergency room, where doctors discovered he had a worm in his brain. Ooh. A worm in his brain, that's right. Doctors used a tool with the camera to perform emergency brain surgery. That's when they discovered the larva of a parasitic tapeworm had formed in a cyst, and it was choking off the circulation of fluids inside Luis's brain.
Luis is recovering but still can't believe his experience. In a CBS News interview, Luis said, yeah, the doctor pulled it out and he said that it was still wiggling. And I'm like, ew, that doesn't sound too good. Like, what are the odds that I'd get a parasite in my head? Well, doctors told Luis that the worm more than likely came from pork or from swimming in a river.
Interesting. Well, one county in Texas is also having problems with cells of a different sort. Larry McGee is looking at that story for us, as well as more information concerning the debt trap of schools and the illicit uses of hidden apps among today's youth. Well, Larry, what do you have for us on these latest stories?
Callahan County Sheriff Terry Joy says his life apprehending, detaining, and monitoring criminals is a full-time, 24-hour-a-day job. Personnel for the sheriff seems not to be a problem, but being able to appropriately house the county's many offenders is. The Callahan jail is only capable of housing 9 residents, but its current inmate population is at 42. The overflow, which the county can't handle, is having to be outsourced to surrounding counties at taxpayers' expense. Sheriff Joy says that the cost of $35 to $45 per day to house an inmate is a burden to citizens, but nevertheless, the taxpayers want enforcement in Callahan County, and they have it. The total cost for housing offenders this year for the county has been $582,000, significantly more than the $150,000 it had budgeted for 2015 to 16. In the end, the sheriff says he doesn't want criminals to get the impression that they can commit a crime in Callahan County and not go to jail, so they will continue to find the money to incarcerate offenders no matter what the price tag. The sheriff believes a lot of the crime in his county is a spillover from the Abilene area. The town of Abilene, of course, is known famously for its 3 major colleges, and this week, debt is again making big headlines, having spiraled out of control to a whopping $1.3 trillion, and that's more than all of the nation's credit card debt. Spotlighted in the media recently was Jess Sanchez, who is a 5th grade teacher with a master's in education and over $90,000 in student debt that it took him to get it. The 35-year-old educator was hoping to be able to use his salary from his new career to save towards his son's college tuition and also his own retirement. But as it stands, half of his $50,000 a year income has to be allocated towards repaying his student loans. At this point, the instructor says he has no budget for retirement and he is just trying to stay afloat in a generation where the retirement age is increasing to 75. The increase in technology is another sign of the times, and the dangers of its misuse is once again catching national attention. In Long Island, New York, sexting among school-aged children is producing everything from community shock to administrative discipline. 2 15-year-olds from the school recounted being suspended from an institute for opening a sex video which was sent to them in a group message. Altogether, 20 students were suspended for up to 5 days for either receiving the video or resending it to other people. In addition, 2 of the school's pupils were arrested and given felony charges for child pornography as well. In other locations throughout the country, there are similar shames. At Canyon City High, in a small town in Colorado, police officials confiscated a student phone with several hundred explicit images, reportedly being traded back and forth like baseball cards. Hundreds of students are said to have been involved in that indignity, concealing their illicit possessions in plain sight in what are being called hidden phone apps. The applications are made to look like innocent tools such as a calculator, but when a specific code is entered, the app reveals secret content. Most children are said to be aware of the applications, but most parents are not. A representative for Common Sense Media, James Stayer, says this is a wake-up call for parents and teachers around the country because children know more about these apps than we do. Some sexting cases are reported to involve children as young as 11 years old, prompting one computer expert and senior editor at CNET stating that with modern technology, there is no way to guarantee your child's safety. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Katan, that's very sad. These phones that we use on a daily basis, they're great tools, but they can definitely be a serious trap and distraction for today's youth.
That's right.
Well, we now turn our attention over to Paris, France, where there have been several terrorist attacks that have taken the city by surprise on a Friday night. A state of emergency has been declared in France, along with the closing of its borders and the level of emergency raised to red, the highest level. These actions declared by the French President François Hollande. Residents are being asked to stay indoors, and others have willfully locked themselves inside for fear of another attack.
There is currently a manhunt underway in France, as many of the attackers have reportedly escaped, of course with the exception of 2 suicide bombers. There is also a current hostage situation with reports of those hostages being executed one by one. Of course, as things unfold, we get clearer information. Currently, authorities do not know who's behind these latest attacks that's being called the worst in the last few decades.
Even though no one has confirmed for certain who's responsible for the attacks, ISIS is claiming responsibility, and the United States is, of course, putting the blame on the terrorist group, as well as the Western media has been broadcasting that throughout the news. So at this point, some are saying it's going to be very hard to stop this juggernaut from a public relations point of view, even though authorities would like to see a proper investigation to really know what has taken place, but that luxury, fearfully, doesn't look like it will be afforded.
Well, so in other words, Jeff, it looks like retaliatory actions will take place first, and if any type of investigation, that is if they actually do an investigation into this, which I would suspect that they would, is done, that'll come later on. And of course, it seems like the U.S. and others are building this case toward ISIS in Syria. So that's eventually where this is going to end up.
That's right. Well, currently NATO administrators and officials are planning an emergency session between Brussels and Washington, D.C. Additionally, the language in the French state of emergency is such that they can claim that the head of the state has been targeted as he was at a nearby football stadium observing a game in session. So he was very close to those attacks.
That's right, close enough to hear the blast. With the borders closed and soldiers on the streets, this definitely qualifies for a state of emergency. So, if the French cabinet convenes and approves the state of emergency, they'll have 12 days for it to go into effect. But based on the NATO treaty, one could argue that if this was a state of war, as declared by the president, by default, other NATO countries could actually come together and act as a coalition, which would, of course, bring any action, military or otherwise, right to Syria's doorstep.
That's getting all the allies together, in other words.
Correct, yep, NATO allies.
According to a geopolitical analyst, Patrick Heiningsson, eyes are on France and other NATO nations to see what's going to take place over the next 72 hours. And he concluded, things are coming to a boil. And I think we know where this is heading, and it's not going to be pleasant.
That's right. So, you may be wondering what France's president has to say about these tragic events, his response, in other words, to terrorism. We'll pay close attention as we play this video of his speech following the attacks in Paris, a video courtesy of The Guardian News.
Ce qui s'est produit hier à Paris et à Saint-Denis, près du Stade de France, c'est un acte de guerre. Et face à la guerre, le pays doit prendre les décisions appropriées. C'est un acte de guerre qui a été commis par une armée terroriste, Daesh, une armée djihadiste contre la France, contre les valeurs que nous défendons partout dans le monde, contre ce que nous sommes, un pays libre qui parle à l'ensemble de la planète. La France sera impitoyable à l'égard des barbares de Daesh. Elle agira avec tous les moyens, dans le cadre du droit, et tous les moyens qui conviennent, et sur tous les terrains, intérieurs comme extérieurs, en concertation avec nos alliés qui eux-mêmes sont visés par cette menace terroriste. Dans cette période si douloureuse, si grave, si décisive pour notre pays, j'en appelle à l'unité, au rassemblement, au sang-froid. Vive la République et vive la France.
Well, with those words, Catan, you may be thinking that we might be headed for an all-out war. Well, you wouldn't be wrong. War takes the lives and causes, of course, the number of the population to drop. But be that big or small, well, that appears to fall right in line with the plans of a man named John Schulenhuber, who says we need to depopulate the world. Now take a look at this next video.
2015 clearly is a crucial year, but this is the year where we make or break a climate agreement. I think we are much more aware of the obstacles, the contradictions, the vested interests involved in order to come up with a climate agreement. But I think we have a really good chance this year to come up with something which puts us on a pathway towards climate stabilization in Paris at the end of the year. And the reason for that is that it is not just a few climate scientists and just a few enlightened government officials, but it is all walks of society, if you like. All quarters of humanity are joining into a choir asking for climate action. And now the Vatican, that means Pope Francis, speaking for 1.2 billion Catholic people on this planet, has weighed in. And he has not weighed in just in saying, well, there may be a problem and some scientists are very concerned, so we should use the precautionary principle. But he said, we are in the midst of an extremely big crisis, threatening the livelihoods of billions of people on this planet. Oh, even worse, we are about to destroy creation. And if we destroy creation, this creation may destroy us, or actually will destroy us.
Well, interesting plans of some. Well, the U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter has accused Russia of posing a threat to international world order, saying Washington would do anything to defend its allies against Moscow. At the Reagan National Defense Forum in California, he stated, "We do not wish to make a warm or a cold war with Russia, but make no mistake, the United States will defend our interests and our allies, the principal international order, and the positive future it affords us all."
Mr. Carter also accused Moscow's actions in Ukraine as dangerous and that Russia was bullying the countries in the Eastern Europe. Lastly, he also criticized Russia's involvement in Syria, saying that the country's military actions in the region will prolong the war in the crisis-sick country, as well as separately criticizing China, its military budget, and its land reclamation in the South China Sea, he said, is disrupting free navigation in the disputed territory.
It's those islands that they're dredging up and making
man-made islands.
them China,
That's right.
Chinese territory. Well, lastly, we close out our report with Saudi Arabia's push for a UN resolution against Iran and Russia over the ongoing war in Syria. The draft resolution has been presented to the UN's General Assembly's Rights Committee. The text condemns Syria for the use of force against Syrians and denounces Iran and Russia for intervening in Syria.
Many have described Riyadh's move as ironic given the major rights violations by Saudi Arabia. The committee that the draft resolution was presented to focuses on human rights. The resolution was co-sponsored by Qatar and other Arab nations, as well as the U.S., Britain, France, and other Western states. It is expected to be put to vote early next week.
The resolution also calls for the Syrian opposition to stop attacks as it benefits ISIL and other terrorist groups. A Syrian delegate reacted angrily to the resolution, saying Saudi Arabia and Qatar had no right to lecture anyone on human rights. Again, analysts say it is very ironic, again, for Saudi Arabia to even push for such a resolution, since that kingdom there is known for major violation of human rights. Yeah. Well, parasites attacking the brain Are children influenced to devalue themselves through sexual activities that bring, of course, STDs into the body? That also affects the mind. These activities bring confusion and the inability to make peaceful decisions. The minds of our world leaders are hell-bent on war and are determined to make their mark on society no matter how many lives are lost in the process. Well, history has shown us hatred, war, and retaliation only breeds more, you guessed it, hatred, war, and retaliation. Foods and activities that mankind were never meant to partake of is just a part of what's bringing the strength of our society down. Mankind's problems are increasing, but there's a small group of growing people whose problems are decreasing. Sounds too great to be true? Well, it is true. Find out how, through the teachings of Yisrael Hawkins and the House of Yahweh, people are improving their lives permanently. Here's what you can do. And don't forget the latest and greatest Bible study tool available today, the Yisrael Says program. You can go to www.yisraelsays.com for all your scriptural questions. And here's more information.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at The House of Yahweh, P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisraelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also check out our new website, www.ypnnews.com. And to email the House of Yahweh, send your emails to info@yahweh.com. And for any calls coming outside the United States, please call the number on your screen. And once again, don't forget www.yisraelsays.com for that great Bible study tool.
Excellent resource, sounds like. Well, don't go anywhere. Grab your pencils, your paper, and Holy Scriptures, because up next is the man anointed to bring forth peace, Yisrael Hawkins. For all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.